Good evening. My talk tonight is focused very narrowly on the archaeological dig that took place on Sabino Head in Phippsburg between 1994 and 2013. The dig was initiated and overseen by Dr. Jeffrey Brains. There he is. Its purpose was to identify and investigate the site of Fort St. George, what we call the Popham Colony. It was this dig that led directly to the creation of the Virginia Project, which in turn metamorphosed into Maine's first ship. I myself am a latecomer to MFS and had nothing to do with the Fort St. George dig, but one of our volunteers from that dig, Orman Hines, has been part of the organization from the beginning and is still with us. He's my role model. My own knowledge of the dig, on the other hand, is derived almost entirely from Jeff Brains' 2-volume, 300-page site report, which is, incidentally, available for purchase in the gift shop. Archaeology seems to be one of those obscure disciplines that many people seem intrinsically interested in, but very few know much about. For those of you who might fall into that category, I intend to focus tonight not only on what Brain and his team learned about Fort St. George, but also on how they went about learning it. In other words, looking at how archaeologists do what they do. William Strate's written in 1612, History of Travel into Virginia, Britannia, gives a brief, basically 2-paragraph description of what he calls Virginia's northern colony, as opposed to the southern colony of Jamestown. This is what 19th century historians would begin calling the Popham Colony. Strate states the colony was founded at the mouth of the Sagadahoc River, what we call the Kennebec, in the place the natives call Sabino. But by the time 19th century historians became interested in the colony, no physical remains of the settlement survived. This is what Sabino Head looks like today. The core of the site is in the lower of the 2 fields on the right-hand side of the slide. A 2-month archaeological dig in 1962 failed to find any definitive evidence of 17th century structures on Sabino Head, even though we now know they were digging in the right place. We now understand that there were at least 2 reasons for this failure. First, part of the site had been disrupted by the construction of Fort Baldwin in the early 20th century. Second, it happens that the settlement was built almost entirely of wood, with none of the stone foundations typical of 17th century English buildings. Since wood decomposes fairly rapidly in most archaeological conditions, there was very little left for traditional archaeological methods of the time to find. And without convincing archaeological evidence, the story of the colony remained a historical footnote that was widely ignored. However, archaeological techniques improved greatly in the years between the 60s and the 90s. When Jeff Brain came to the site in 1994, he knew to dig deeper than previously. And in addition to any objects he found, he recorded subtle changes in soil color and texture, which enabled him to identify holes and ditches that had filled in later, as well as soil stains left behind by decomposed timbers. Here you can see one of Brain's diggers holding a soil sample on his trowel in his right hand, while he compares it to the catalog of soil colors in his lap in order to record the color accurately. And you can see there's about 30 color swatches, various shades of dirt, and he has to match it as accurately as he can. Brain was also able to focus his dig more precisely by making particularly detailed use of the Hunt Plan, a document that had been preserved in the Spanish Royal Archives, where it was only rediscovered in the late 19th century. The title in the upper left reads, "The Draft of St. George's Fort, erected by Captain George Popham, Esquire, on the entry of the famous river of Sagadahoc, taken out by John Hunt the 8th day of October in the year of our Lord, 1607. The plan depicts a massively walled fort with 9 cannon and 16 buildings, all carefully labeled. Although it looks more like a Tudor castle than a 17th century settlement, Brain believed it might nevertheless preserve an accurate scale map of the site, and he speculated that Hunt was in fact the surveyor who had laid out the entire settlement. Brain's approach to the Fort St. George dig provides a good model of how archaeologists typically go about their work. The first problem any archaeologist faces is identifying a site and figuring out exactly where to dig. For sites dating from the historical era, that is, after the introduction of writing in a particular place, this usually involves mentions in documentary sources. In Brain's case, he was able to build on Strachey's mention of Sabino by overlaying the Hunt plan on a modern contour map of Sabino Head and then carefully matching the fort's outline to the coastline. Note that the first thing Brain had to do was rotate the Hunt plan 90 degrees clockwise, since like most maps of the time, it was oriented with east at the top. Although the coastline has shifted a bit over the past 400 years, you can still see how Hunt's walls follow it, and how Hunt's hilltop fortification aligns perfectly with the steep granite outcrop on the topo map. There's the extra fortification, and there's the cliff today. Once an archaeologist has identified a potential site, the next step is to test that site by doing an exploratory dig. So in the summer of 1994, Jeff Brain secured the sponsorship of the Peabody Essex Museum, obtained a grant from the National Geographic Society, put together a team of half a dozen archaeologists, and dug 2 exploratory trenches in Fort Baldwin State Park on Sabino Head. He laid out these parallel trenches to begin on the western side of the site, outside the wall shown in the Hunt plan. So the trenches began out here and went in. They continued east through the middle of Hunt's settlement. So they basically ran like this. And although neither trench produced evidence of a wall or any other fortification, the second trench did intersect a 2-foot diameter post hole containing a soil stain left by a heavy, square-hewn wooden structural post. The fill of that post hole contained a fragment of early 17th century English pottery, a hand-hewn nail, and a glass bead. The structural post was located right where Building 5, the storehouse, appears on Hunt's plan. There is the storehouse. This proved 2 things to Brain's satisfaction. Not only did the small finds prove that there had been an early English settlement on the site at the time, but the location of a structural post right where Hunt placed the storehouse seemed to confirm the scale and accuracy of the Hunt plan. Having confirmed the site's location, the archaeologist's next hurdle is to gather the resources required for a full-scale dig. Brain spent the next 3 years in preparation. His biggest tasks were to develop a long-term excavation plan, secure ongoing funding, and gain permission to dig. He used the Hunt plan to draw up a search grid of 1 meter squares to cover the entire site. The 2 rows of squares which start further west mark the original trial trenches from 1994. Brain also obtained ongoing funding from the Maine Commission for Historic Preservation and the Maine State Museum's Field School program. The students from that program, in addition to local volunteers, would provide a source of free labor for the dig. Always important. Finally, although most of the site already belonged to the state of Maine as part of Fort Baldwin State Park, Brain was also able to secure permission to dig from some, though not all, of the local landowners whose property abutted the park. The most important of these was Jane Stevens, who insisted that Brain dig up her back garden and became an enthusiastic patron of the project. Over the course of the dig, Jane Stevens served as the primary point of contact between the archaeological team and the residents of Popham Village. And the story is that the Virginia project grew out of meetings around Jane's kitchen table to discuss the story of the Popham Colony and how best to build public awareness of it. The dig proper began in the summer of 1997 and continued with a couple of breaks until 2013. The organization of the excavation provides a good example of how a dig of this scale would typically be carried out. Each summer's digging season would begin with a site initially cleared, since any old trenches would have been filled in the end of the previous season to preserve the site. A new series of excavation units, each 1 meter square and numbered according to Brain's overall excavation plan, would be opened up. Here you can see several new excavation units being opened up, as well as a previous unit in the lower left corner that's been filled in. Note the 2 tripods holding square sieves. Most of the actual digging was carried out by the students and volunteers. They were supervised by a core crew of 3 professional archaeologists under the overall direction of Brain himself. The diggers first remove the topsoil with shovels, sieving as they go to catch any small finds that might be missed. Once the topsoil is removed, they proceed carefully with trowels. You can barely see the trowel in his gloved hand. And you notice he's not digging, he's scraping. They scrape their way down layer by layer, mapping the various levels or strata of the site. And you can see between the grass and the level he's at, if you look at the side of the excavation unit, there will be different layers of soil that are exposed. And he will have used his trowel to carefully scrape that clean so you can see the layers as clearly as possible. So those layers are called the stratigraphy of the site. In this stratigraphy diagram of one excavation unit from the first trial trench, unit P113, you can see the broad history of this portion of the site, which lay outside the boundary wall of Hunt's settlement, so off to the west there. The pebbly bottom layer is glacial till deposited during the last ice age. Above that was a thick layer cake of sandy soil deposited over many centuries. In the middle of that sandy layer was a thinner layer, a lens of charred soil containing fragments of prehistoric pottery, burned bone, and fire-cracked rock. Brain interpreted this as a native hearth or fire pit. On the far right of the slide, you can see an area of disturbed soil that projects down into the hearth. This intrusion must have taken place later, most likely as part of the construction of Fort Baldwin in the early 20th. Above that, and therefore laid down more recently, was an agricultural zone caused by plowing. Above that was a layer of highly compacted road fill that had been laid down as part of the construction of a parking lot for the state park in the aftermath of World War II. Finally, the uppermost layer of topsoil is part of the grassy meadow that makes up this part of the park today. Consider all this information, then multiply this by the hundreds of excavation units that are part of a dig of this scale. In the end, it will be up to the lead archaeologist to piece together the evidence of the stratigraphy from all the individual excavation units and assemble them into an overall picture of how the site developed over time. So, what evidence did the Fort St. George dig actually uncover? Brain did eventually find some evidence of a very shallow ditch surrounding part of the settlement, though nothing like the massive wall shown in the Hunt plan. Inside that minimal boundary, however, he found an impressive number of post holes and post molds. These are worth explaining in detail, so bear with me for a moment. In order to set a wooden post in the ground, you dig a hole with a diameter wider than your post, set the post in the hole, then fill in the hole around the post with the dirt you have just dug out. Now the dirt you shovel back into the hole will be less compacted than the surrounding soil and will also be all jumbled up. Remember that you are inadvertently digging down through earlier archaeological strata as you dig your hole, and soils of different colors from different levels are getting mixed together and creating a different color of soil. Because of this, a sharp-eyed digger can often spot changes in soil color and texture that mark the edges of a post hole. Often, this is very subtle, often too subtle for me to spot as a digger. But here we have an unusually clear example. You should all be able to see a large, roughly circular patch of slightly darker soil in the center of the slide. That's the post hole. Now look at the much darker squarish patch of soil in the center of the hole. That is the post mold, a soil stain left behind when a wooden post decomposed. In this second example, the soil in the post hole was distinct enough that the digger was able to scrape away the surrounding dirt and get a better look. That is a surviving post hole. Because the post hole is at the very edge of the excavation unit, you can also see the darker stain of the post mold, not only in the center of the post hole itself, but also in the wall of the excavation unit. The evidence of the post holes and post molds was extensive enough that in 3 cases, Brain and his team were able to reconstruct the footprints of specific buildings shown in the hunt plan. These were the storehouse, Building 5, you've already been introduced to that, the Buttery General, Building 8, and the chapel, Building 2. What I'm using here is a high contrast version of the original hunt plan that also substitutes a more legible modern font. That should make life easier for all of us. The first and most substantial footprint the team investigated was that of the storehouse. This warehouse was arguably the most important building in Fort St. George. Not only was it the largest building in the hunt plan, but according to Strachey, it was also the first to be constructed. This makes sense when we remember that the entire settlement was a project of the Virginia Company of Plymouth, a joint stock company, the purpose of which was to enhance shareholder value by developing commercial opportunities in British North America. Brain was able to identify 15 post holes with post molds laid out in 2 parallel rows. Here you can see how the 2 rows of post holes divide a long, narrow rectangle, and you can also see how the second exploratory trench here intersects one of the post holes. So that's that exploratory trench, cutting randomly, but fortunately, right through a post hole. In one exceptional case, the base of a post had not fully decomposed and could actually be extracted. It's a little hard to see, but that black object is the base of a heavy wooden post. The aluminum poles in this slide mark the positions of one row of post molds. You can see how evenly they were laid out. Additionally, diggers found the charred remains of a horizontal sill plate that ran between several posts. You can see the straight line of the blackened sill plate intersecting the base of a post in the lower middle of the excavated area. There's the base of the post. And continuing on toward the upper right corner. So that is all sill plate. Oh, you can't see through this area that hasn't been fully excavated yet. But it continues underneath. The team also found some charred patches of thatch and tangles of light sticks called wattle. Brain interpreted these partially charred remains as evidence of a relatively low temperature fire that probably took place after the building had been abandoned. No evidence of wooden flooring was found, interestingly, suggesting a simple earthen floor. This is the kind of structural evidence that archaeologists love. With these buried clues, Brain and his team were able to reconstruct what the full frame of the original building must have looked like. Adjacent vertical posts would have been linked together along the length of the building by horizontal sill plates at ground level and corresponding wall plates at roof level. The whole structure would have been held together by horizontal beams running across the width of the building from one post to its opposite number, creating a box frame structure consisting of 7 rectangular bays. Rafters to carry a thatched roof would have rested on the beams. So there's a beam, there's the rafters coming down to rest on it. And wattle and daub wall panels would have been anchored to the timber posts and beams that defined each wall bay. So each of these bays would be filled with wattle and daub. Here is what wattle and daub panels look like. This is from a surviving late medieval building in Germany. Where the mud-like daub has disintegrated, you can see that behind it were vertical sticks that were set into the building's horizontal beams. There's a stick, there's a stick. And then thinner horizontal wattles were woven between them. The resulting wickerwork was then covered with daub, a mud plaster mixed with organic material such as manure or marsh grass. And we have to assume at Fort St. George it was something like marsh grass, because as far as we know, they did not have any domestic animals. So together, the wattle and daub formed these solid wall panels. This half-timber construction was a basic medieval building technique that would hardly have been considered stylish in 1607, but was perfectly functional. The most primitive elements of this building were its earthen floor and its earth-fast construction. That is, the fact that its posts were driven directly into the ground rather than resting on any sort of foundation wall. Except for the fact that this building consisted of 7 bays rather than the 8 that Hunt shows, and given the fact that we can't ascertain whether it actually had the windows and dormers that Hunt depicts, it conforms remarkably to the building depicted in the Hunt plan, and the dimensions work out according to Hunt's scale as well. The second footprint Brain identified belonged to the buttery, a name given to smaller storehouses typically used for storing butts or barrels of wine and other foodstuffs. This structure was outlined by a rectangle of 10 post holes with post molds. Although the 2 rows of 4 post holes each, which define the length of the building, were not aligned quite as accurately as those of the storehouse, it seems safe to assume that this was a second post and lintel box frame construction. The third footprint, which corresponded to the chapel in the Hunt plan, was more problematic. Although the chapel is the second largest building on the plan after the storehouse, Brain could only locate 8 potential post holes, not all of which still contain surviving post molds. You can see that one of the post holes was placed in the interior of the building along the center line. So here's one of the long walls of the chapel. Here's the end, here's the beginning of the other long wall that had not yet been fully excavated. The next slide will show it better. And there is that unusual interior post. The post molds which did survive were notably smaller and more irregular than those associated with the storehouse. Most significantly, they did not define the regular series of rectangular bays associated with post and lintel construction. You can tell that because there should be post holes opposite one another here. And even though it looks like these 2 might be opposite, once you measure carefully, you realize that to be rectangular, to be perpendicular to each other, this post hole should be several feet over this way. And that's enough to throw off any builder worth his salt. You can't run a horizontal beam across that with any luck. Brain suggested that the chapel was built using a simpler, more lightly built technique that relied on a ridge pole supported by a row of forked posts called crotchets running down the center line of the building. Brain also noted that the chapel was burned at some point, but not completely destroyed. But he did not find evidence of reconstruction the way he did, the way we'll discuss in a minute with the next building. Interestingly, none of those 3 buildings were residential houses. However, Brain did find clear evidence for one house, although he was unable to clearly establish its footprint or fully reconstruct it. This was the largest of the 10 houses with chimneys depicted in the Hunt plan, the Admiral's house, Building 3. As the Admiral of the colony was second in authority after the President, Brain identified this as Raleigh Gilbert's house. Brain found a collection of 12 post holes with the remains of a semicircular hearth containing several heat-damaged hearthstones at the western end of the post holes. No chimney stones were found. The illustration on the lower right shows how a wattle and daub chimney could potentially have been constructed without stones, although this would have presumably required flanking posts. Of the 12 post holes that were found, 3 contained the expected fill and post molds. 3 contained pad stones rather than post molds, suggesting that their posts had later been removed. 4 contained post molds that had been charred, and 2 contained only charred fill. Brain concluded that a portion of the house had burned and later been rebuilt. However, although the Hunt plan depicts the Admiral's house as a box frame building consisting of 4 bays, none of the post holes here can be organized into a coherent series of rectangles. Instead, as Brain observes in his site report, we seem to have a much more primitive architecture composed of irregular post placement and perhaps, again, some form of crotchet construction. Hunt places the settlement's other high-status residence, the President's House, Building 1, up here on the cliff, on a rocky outcrop dominating the southeast corner of the settlement. As Brain observed, no evidence of a structure is apparent on this bare rock ledge. Although the team investigated a number of other building locations shown in the Hunt plan, and they were able to find a few individual post holes, Brain was unable to uncover firm evidence of any other houses or fireplace hearths. However, while exploring the area of the Smithy's house, Building 13, he did discover the remains of 4 open-air bloomery hearths for smelting raw bog iron to remove the slag. There they are in the upper left, Roman numerals 1 through 4. Bog iron deposits can still be found near Sabino Head, and this is significant evidence of economic activity at Fort St. George, which is not mentioned in any of the early historical sources. In comparing the surviving archaeological evidence to the Hunt plan, it seems clear that the plan was in fact used to guide the layout of Fort St. George. However, the evidence also suggests that the plan was never followed through to completion. The first structure to be built, the storehouse, came surprisingly close to the building depicted in the plan. On the other hand, the elaborate fortifications shown in the plan never seem to have been built at all. Evidence of the numerous houses shown in the plan is also surprisingly scarce. As we've seen, the remains of only one house with a fireplace, the Admiral's house, can be conclusively identified, and it seems to have been rather ramshackle for the residence of one of the settlement's leaders. So far, we focused on one of any archaeologist's 2 main objectives: to record the landscape of a particular site over the course of its development and reconstruct the buildings and other structural features that were part of the landscape. We now come to the archaeologist's second, equally important and complementary objective: to examine and catalog all of the small finds found on the site. This is the side of archaeology that usually gets the headlines, thinks Indiana Jones. It's important to remember, however, that if a site has simply been abandoned rather than being overwhelmed by a sudden disaster like Pompeii, then the objects left behind for archaeologists to find will generally be things that have been discarded, broken, or lost. In the case of Fort St. George, these objects included over 5,000 bits of iron slag, the byproduct of smelting bog iron, over 2,500 fragments of hand-wrought nails, some 2,000 fragments of glass, and another 2,000 fragments of European pottery. One of the archaeologist's most important tasks is to carefully organize this mountain of evidence and publish it. This enables other archaeologists and cross-trained historians like myself to analyze the evidence from the site, compare it with evidence from other sources, and draw their own conclusions. An archaeologist's first task in dealing with this mountain of evidence is to categorize and date each fragment or artifact as precisely as possible and identify its place of origin. This process of dating and placing is done by looking for the best match between your artifact and one that has already been dated and placed by archaeologists on other sites. This in turn requires being able to describe your artifact as precisely as possible. For example, to identify the thousands of fragments of pottery that they found, Brain and his team used standardized criteria to categorize the color of the fired clay, its texture, hardness, thickness, and glaze color. They would then look for a match in reference books or site reports with equally detailed descriptions of pottery that had already been dated and placed. Very often you can end up determining sometimes which particular pottery back in England produced something, or at least which region within a few miles, and often get the date, if you're lucky, within a decade or so. Noting precisely where each artifact was found within the site is also an important part of the archaeological process. Different areas within a site may contain different distributions of artifacts, which can be associated with specific uses or purposes. One corner of the storehouse, for example, contained a number of military artifacts, including small pieces of armor called tasset lames, this is item D, part of a musket mechanism, fragment E, and several lead musket balls, F. A collection of 150 manufactured glass beads, you just see a few of them in G, presumably brought as trade goods, was found along one wall. A caulking iron, A, and a number of iron roves or washers, fragments B and C, both used in shipbuilding, were also found. The storehouse also contained the greatest number of iron nails and fragments found on the site, suggesting that these may have been used in its construction, even though box frame construction was traditionally pegged, or trunneled if you're a sailor, rather than nailed. Interestingly, the storehouse does not seem to have been used to store provisions. Instead, numerous fragments of storage vessels were found in the buttery. This included not only fragments of ordinary pottery from the west of England, fragments A, B, and C, but also a fancy Bellarmine jug from the Rhineland, 2 fragments D and E, and an olive jar from Spain or Portugal, fragment F, as well as a single nearly intact glass wine bottle, probably from France. This find reminds us that another useful archaeological skill is facility with 3D jigsaw puzzles. Intriguingly, other finds from the buttery had nothing to do with food. These included a bunch of things with military connections: lead spills, sprues, finished musket balls, and a chunk of English flint. All of those associated with muskets, as well as a clay tobacco pipe, M. The Admiral's house contained the highest percentage of what archaeologists describe as high-status objects, which are generally associated with the more affluent members of society at a given time. There were numerous fragments of imported ceramics. We just get a handful here in this presentation slide. There were a lot more. These included more Iberian olive jars, example E, and embossed Bellarmine jugs, F, as well as decorated Delftware apothecary jars, most likely from Holland, that's D. There were also fragments of many types of glassware. These included case bottles for alcohol, that's K, serving flasks, G, and wine glasses, as well as a window pane, L, a glass mirror, H, and several glass buttons for a gentleman's attire, J. Unfortunately, those are very difficult to see in the slide. Also found were fragments of more common pottery and more musket balls. A similar but smaller collection of high-status objects was found in the area north of the chapel where Hunt places the Vice Admiral's house. And the historical records don't actually list a Vice Admiral. These included some excellent examples of more Bellarmine stoneware, those wine jugs from the Rhineland. A through H are all Bellarmine. And several pieces of tin glazed Delftware, I through K. and various glassware, R through V. These finds were associated with a substantial area of charred soil, but no post holes or other structural evidence was found. This raises the possibility that even some of Fort St. George's gentlemen found themselves living in tents or other ad hoc housing that left no structural evidence for the archaeologists to find. In addition to its high status objects, the area of the Vice Admiral's house also contained good examples of the more common artifacts which could be found throughout Fort St. George. These included clay tobacco pipes, L and M, lead musket balls, spills, and sprues. When I talk about sprues, does everyone understand? These are sprues. They come when you mold musket balls by pouring them into a mold, and then you break them off from the sprue. And that's why you also find lead spills usually in the same area. Also included a wide range of earthenware pots and bowls, fragments N and Q, all produced in the west of England, not too far from Plymouth. And this range of fragments shows you the variety of colors and shapes. Well, you can't really tell much about the forms, but the surprising variety of clay bodies and glazes that you found, but they were all produced in the west of England near Plymouth. Here are fragments of two distinctive cooking pots whose shape identifies them as coming from Totnes in South Devon, near Raleigh Gilbert's ancestral home. They're arranged to show the distinctive rim, body, base, and handles of this form. This close-up shows how this simple, low-fired earthenware of something like these Totnes pots stands in marked contrast to the high-status objects like the embossed stoneware Bellarmine jugs. So take a look at these and then remind yourself of what the Bellarmine fragments looked like. Here's a reminder of what they were about the Bellarmine. Although Jeff Brain's dig on Sabino Head had the express purpose of identifying and examining the location of Fort St. George, he did adhere to sound archaeological technique and kept a record of everything else he found as well. Although he did not find traces of any physical structures that predated Fort St. George, he did find charred areas in the earlier levels of the site that he identified as Native American hearths, as well as a variety of small finds dating all the way from what archaeologists call the Middle Archaic period, between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, up through the Contact period, 400 to 500 years ago. Much of this evidence was found in the fill of pits and post holes where it had been disturbed and redeposited by later activity. Some was found near the surface of the soil where it had been brought up by plowing. Small finds included over 6,000 rhyolite and chert flakes produced by the manufacture of stone tools, and over 2,000 pottery fragments, as well as fill from 2 shell middens comprising uncountable numbers of oyster shells and bits of charred bone, predominantly from cod and deer, as well as fragments of pottery. One of the shell middens, at least, was roughly 5 feet in diameter and at least a foot thick. All of this prehistoric evidence was presumably deposited by the ancestors of the Wabanaki people who continued to live in this region into the historical period. It confirms that Sabino Head had been part of a network of seasonal settlement sites for thousands of years before the arrival of the English. The early stone artifacts found on the site can be subdivided into 2 main categories: those that were made by grinding or abrading, and those that were made by flaking or chipping. Grinding was a technique used to shape stones that already had an appropriate shape into simple forms like shallow bowls, hammerstones, and adzes. Different types of rock were used for different purposes. Here you can see a set of small slate rods and 2 adzes. All of these date from no later than the late Archaic period, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. The feltsite adze on the left has been painstakingly rubbed smooth, while the granite adze on the right has been roughly ground down. These more recent examples from Micronesia show how the completed adzes might have been constructed with right-angled wood handles. This is a typical adze with the blade so that you could dig in with it. This is unusual, and I think some archaeologists might define this as an axe rather than an adze, simply because the blade is arranged the other way. And it seems at least possible that the granite blade that we saw a minute ago, the one on the right, might have been hooked up this way. In contrast to these ground artifacts, those that have been produced by flaking had been crafted, most of the flaked artifacts had been crafted from a specific kind of volcanic rock called rhyolite. Rhyolite, like flint, is a fine-grained rock that can be chipped into sharp flakes or blades when struck with another hard object, such as a granite hammerstone. The most common objects produced in this way were projectile points, single-edged scrapers, and double-edged knives. Here are two knives from the second half of the late Archaic period, between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. The older of the two is shown with a reconstructed wooden handle. The oldest of all the flaked artifacts found on the site were 3 projectile points that date to the Middle Archaic, 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. However, the greatest number of stone artifacts, including over 50 points, scrapers, and knives, date from what archaeologists call the Ceramic period, starting roughly 3,000 years ago. The group of flaked stone points on the right shows the range of styles and shapes that developed over the centuries covered by the Ceramic period. The bone points on the left were crafted by grinding rather than flaking, and are a reminder that not all early tools were made of stone. Presumably a lot were also made of wood, but those very, very rarely survive. The beginning of the Ceramic period gives archaeologists a new type of evidence to help with dating. Like stone artifacts, pottery can be roughly dated according to its shape and style. But since clay is much easier to shape than stone, ceramic styles evolve more rapidly. So archaeologists have been able to distinguish 7 stylistic sub-periods within the Ceramic period. On the left of this slide, you can see 3 different ceramic styles arranged in horizontal rows. The bottom row, G through I, contains fragments of cord-marked pottery from Ceramic period 3 or 4, roughly 1,000 to 1,700 years ago. You can see the parallel lines where a length of cord was wrapped around the pot and pressed into the wet clay before firing to give it a striated surface texture. Probably easiest to see in this one. The middle row, D through F, contains cord-wrapped stick pottery from Ceramic period 4 or 5, so a bit later, a bit closer to the present, roughly 700 to 1,400 years ago. Here, a stick has been wrapped with cord and then pressed into the wet clay, giving it a series of wide rows and furrows. There's probably the best example of that. Finally, the top row, A through C, contains fragments of incised pottery, a later style typical of Ceramic periods 6 and 7, roughly 700 to 400 years ago. In this style, the collar of the pot is grooved with a pattern of intersecting lines. Here are examples of pots from other Maine sites that are more intact to give you a clearer idea of what the pottery looked like initially before it was reduced to fragments. The pot on the left is a good example of cord-wrapped stick pottery from Ceramic period 4. Here it's much easier to see the wide parallel rows made by the impression of the cord-wrapped stick. The 2 pots on the right are examples of an earlier style called dentate stamped pottery, in which patterns are created by repeatedly pressing a pointed object or stamp into the wet clay. The pot in the center dates from Ceramic period 3, roughly 1,400 to 1,700 years ago. while the pot on the right is from ceramic period 2, 2200 to 1700 years ago. Brain's team found examples of pottery from ceramic period 1 all the way through to ceramic period 7, suggesting that the site was occupied at least intermittently throughout the ceramic period up to the beginning of the contact period some 400 to 500 years ago. The pre-contact finds from Fort St. George also included fragments of 3 native tobacco pipes, 2 made of clay and 1 made of stone, and 7 beads made from native copper. These both provide evidence of important long-distance cultural and trade connections in pre-contact North America. While tobacco was common in Mexico and the American Southwest, but is not native to Maine, and so must have been imported through trade. Similarly, the nearest source of native copper was in what is now the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, again implying long-distance trade. It seems clear that Fort St. George was intended to take advantage of that long-standing tradition of trade, as well as seek out natural resources that could be exploited directly by the English. The storehouse contained 150 glass beads intended for trade, and as we know from Strachey, George Popham offered local dignitaries gifts of steel knives and copper beads, which must have been brought from England for that purpose, along with the glass beads. Some of the late ceramic period material found in the Fort St. George dig could potentially date from either before or after the years 1607 to 8. And there is some debate over whether the site may have actually been reoccupied after the departure of the English. In any event, it's worth remembering that this site preserves 2 different sets of evidence with 2 very different time scales and can be used to tell 2 very different, if overlapping, stories. From the European perspective, this site records a brief, unsuccessful foray into a strange new environment. From the Wabanaki perspective, it records a settled rhythm of life that stretched back thousands of years. I regret that I lack the ability to tell you more about the early history of Sabino Head and the people who lived throughout this part of Maine for over 5,000 years. But I strongly urge you to join us here next Wednesday when our speaker will address that very subject. As you've already been told, he is Maine State Archaeologist Art Spies, and he has first-hand knowledge of the Fort St. George dig. The images of the prehistoric finds I showed you tonight are thanks to him, and I very much look forward to seeing what he has to say next week. Thank you.